What would have happened if Eve hadn't eaten the fruit? This is, perhaps, the most fundamental question for our civilization, the starting point for nearly our entire moral, philosophical, and psychological framework. Before kings, empires, and technologies, there was a choice in a garden, a moment so primordial we treat it more like a myth than an event. But here, in our laboratory of speculative history, we treat it as humanity's first and most impactful point of divergence. It's the epicenter of an earthquake whose aftershocks define the world you and I know. So let's use our AI simulation to rewind the tape to that crucial moment, not to judge it, but to disable it, and see what grows in its place. Our simulation doesn't process the Garden of Eden like a Renaissance painting, but as an ecosystem of variables. The air humidity, the genetic makeup of the flora and fauna, and, most importantly, the neurochemistry of its only 2 human inhabitants, free from what we would today call stress, anxiety, or existential dread. The AI reconstructs the scene. Eve isn't facing a hissing, cartoonish serpent, but an entity whose proposition is, at its core, logical. The serpent, in our simulation, represents the first manifestation of a purely analytical question: is there a better state than this? For a mind that has only known perfection and harmony, this isn't a temptation toward evil, but an intellectual puzzle. The promise isn't one of pleasure, but of optimization. You shall be as God, knowing good and evil. And this is where our alternate timeline begins. The AI projects Eve's response, not based on the guilt or fear that would come later, but on the pure logic of her current state. She observes the fruit, smells it, a scent the simulation describes as a blend of fig, mango, and something utterly alien, sweet and vibrant. She looks at the serpent, and instead of giving in to curiosity about the unknown, she applies that same curiosity to what she already knows. In our simulation, her response is calm, almost didactic. Why would I seek knowledge that puts me in God's place, when the very joy of my existence is to walk with Him in the cool of the day? Knowing what He knows wouldn't make me His equal. It would only saddle me with the weight of His responsibilities, without His capacity to bear them. Perfection doesn't lie in knowing everything, but in fully trusting the one who does. The serpent, faced with an irrefutable logic born not of blind obedience but of complete contentment, simply falls silent. The proposition has failed. The experiment is over. This non-event is the trigger for the most profound butterfly effect we can imagine. Adam approaches, not to find an ashamed wife covering herself with fig leaves, but to find her exactly as she's always been, radiant, serene, an integral part of the landscape. There's no accusation, no fear of God's voice echoing through the garden, no expulsion. That moment of trauma, which according to so many theologies and psychologies is written into our cultural DNA as original sin, simply doesn't happen. The first betrayal, the first lie, the first experience of shame, all of it is aborted. The cascading consequences are monumental, as the very foundation of the human psyche as we know it, built upon the duality of good and evil, guilt and redemption, is never laid. Humanity, therefore, remains in its state of functional innocence, but innocence here doesn't mean childishness. It means an existence without the internal fracture that defines us, without the need to hide, to justify ourselves, or to compete for validation. But if Eden wasn't lost, if the exile never happened, what comes next? Would humanity remain forever contained within this walled paradise, a perfect yet static experiment? Or, in the absence of the fall, would the Eden project itself begin to expand, transforming the rest of the planet in its own image and likeness? That's the next phase of our simulation. Earth as a direct continuation of Eden becomes the next logical step in our AI simulation, and the image it projects is both familiar and profoundly alien. The first thing we need to understand is that Eden in this alternate timeline isn't a walled fortress, a static and limited paradise. It's a process, a state of being. And as humanity, now without the fracture of the fall, begins to multiply, Eden itself expands with it. The simulation shows us this not as a conquest, but as a flourishing. Wherever the descendants of Adam and Eve settle, the surrounding environment begins to transform, to harmonize. It's a geological and biological butterfly effect. The AI renders images of deserts that, over centuries, become lush savannas, not through forced irrigation, but through a symbiotic partnership between man and the land. Humanity doesn't dominate nature, it cultivates and elevates it. Our cities, with their scars of concrete and steel, simply don't exist. In their place, the simulation shows us what we can only call bioarchitecture. Human settlements that grow in spirals, following the patterns of a sunflower or a galaxy. Dwellings aren't built, but grown, from trees with flexible and resilient wood, shaped over decades to form arches and domes that breathe with the forest. Imagine waking up, not to the sound of traffic, but to the symphony of birds nesting in the very structure of your home. The smell isn't of pollution, but of damp earth, sap, and the scent of flowers that are an integral part of the walls. Technology here isn't mechanical, but organic. Tools are made of obsidian, bone, and wood, but with a precision and design that surpass our own engineering, as they are born of a deep, intuitive understanding of the materials. Energy doesn't come from burning fossil fuels, but perhaps from subtle forms of bioluminescence or harnessed geothermal power, accessed without the need for brutal drilling. The cascading consequences for social organization are just as profound. Without shame, guilt, and fear, the need for hierarchies based on power and control never arises. There are no nations, borders, or armies. Why would there be? Competition for resources is a non-existent concept in a world of abundance managed in perfect harmony. The simulation projects a global yet decentralized society, organized into clans or extended families that see themselves as branches of a single tree. Leadership is exercised by the wisest and most experienced, not as rulers but as advisors, whose authority lies in their ability to maintain balance and harmony. Language evolves without words for war, betrayal, or greed. Art doesn't express anguish or seek catharsis, but is a pure celebration of beauty, discovery, and communion with the divine. Science and spirituality are a single discipline. To study the cosmos is to study the mind of God. To map a plant's genome is to read one of his poems. In this timeline, humanity develops a radically different collective psyche. The absence of original sin means there's no concept of a flawed human nature to be overcome or redeemed. Each individual is born with an innate sense of belonging, a direct and unbroken connection to the Creator and all of creation. The exploration of the world isn't driven by conquest but by a holy curiosity. The AI shows us expeditions mapping the ocean floor and the highest mountains, not to extract or to claim, but simply to know, to marvel. Humanity's cultural DNA was written in a completely different ink, one of trust, joy, and integrated purpose, not of struggle, suffering, and the search for a lost meaning. But all this harmony, this Edenic expansion that turns the planet into a unified garden, only exists because a fundamental piece of our historical and psychological puzzle was removed at the crucial moment: the serpent. The proposition that, in our reality, broke everything, here simply failed. The simulation treated it as a logical catalyst that found no reaction. But what did it really represent? Was it just a creature, a metaphor for doubt, or something far more complex and deliberate? If you're fascinated by this vision of a world without our scars, leave a like to let us know. Now let's dive into this mystery, because understanding the serpent's role is the key to understanding the nature of the freedom that was offered, and that, in this reality, was never lost. The role of the serpent. What did it represent? This is perhaps the most complex question our AI simulation needs to process for this alternate timeline to make sense. Let's be clear, The image of a literal snake hissing magical words is an oversimplification that strips the moment of its depth. In our analysis, the serpent isn't just an animal, it's a principle, a catalyst. Our AI simulation interprets it not as an evil entity, but as the personification of an alternative logic, the proposal of a new operating system for human consciousness. Think about it. Until that moment, humanity operated on a system of intuitive trust, of total integration with the environment and the divine. The serpent arrives and offers the first software of skepticism. Its proposal isn't simply disobey, but rather question. It introduces the idea that there might be hidden knowledge, a power that's being withheld. It's the voice that whispers, "You can be autonomous. You don't have to trust. You can know for yourself." It is, in essence, the birth of analytical doubt. The simulation shows us this moment, the point of divergence, with stunning clarity. It's not a dramatic battle between good and evil. It's a moment of profound conceptual incompatibility. The AI renders the scene. The serpent, whose form the simulation leaves ambiguous, sometimes a creature of dark light, other times a talking shadow, presents its logic to Eve. The words, laden with the promise of becoming like God, echo in the Edenic air. But in this timeline, they find no resonance. Eve's mind, shaped by harmony and trust, simply can't process the premise. It's like trying to explain the color red to someone born without the cones to perceive it. The idea that the Creator, the source of all life and beauty, would be withholding something out of pettiness or fear is so alien, so illogical within that paradigm, that the proposal dissolves into thin air. The temptation isn't overcome by willpower. It simply fails to form. The seed of doubt falls on infertile ground. The serpent isn't defeated. It is, for all intents and purposes, ignored like meaningless noise. The cascading consequences of this communication failure are what define this entire universe. Without the installation of this software of doubt, humanity never develops the self-awareness based on separation. That feeling of being an isolated I, in opposition to the other and the world, never blossoms. The serpent, in our story, represented the shattering of the mirror. The moment humanity first saw itself as a fragmented individual, and with that came shame, fear, and the need to hide. In this alternate timeline, the mirror never shatters. Human consciousness remains holistic, integrated. The serpent, then, isn't remembered as the source of all suffering, but perhaps as an anomaly, a confused creature that proposed a paradox and went on its way. Its failure wasn't an act of moral rejection, but proof that its logic was incompatible with the fundamental reality of Eden. It offered the key to a door no one was interested in opening, because on the other side, there was already infinity. This monumental failure to introduce the concept of separation is what preserves the human psyche in its original state. The serpent didn't represent pure evil, but the asterisk alternative, the option of a consciousness based on analysis, distrust, and ego. By being rejected, humanity continued on its course of integrated development, an evolution without the fracture of original sin. But what would a mind that never learned to doubt itself actually be like? One that never felt the sting of shame, the weight of self-analysis, or the anguish of existential loneliness. This is where the simulation begins to show us the most profound and unsettling changes, as we dive directly into the architecture of a human soul that was never broken. How the absence of sin would shape the human psyche is perhaps the most baffling and, at the same time, most beautiful part of our AI simulation. Understanding this is like trying to describe a color we've never seen. Our minds, yours and mine, were forged in the fracture. We are the direct result of that point of divergence of the choice that installed the software of doubt and separation. Our consciousness is a constant battlefield between desire and duty, between who we are and who we think we should be. The simulation, by showing us the architecture of a mind that never suffered this break, reveals something radically different. The AI renders the neurological map of these human beings, And it doesn't look like a city full of dead-end alleys and traffic jams. It looks more like an ecosystem, a luminous forest where every thought, every impulse flows in harmony with the whole. There's no voice of the inner critic, that censor judging our every step. There is no weight of ancestral guilt. The human psyche in this timeline isn't a duality at war, but a cohesive unity. It's the difference between an orchestra where each musician tries to play louder than the next, and a symphony where every note exists to serve the beauty of the whole piece. The first cascading consequence the simulation shows us, in an almost palpable way, is the total and absolute absence of shame. Think about all the decisions you make, from the clothes you wear to the words you choose, that are somehow shaped by the fear of judgment. Now, erase that. The AI shows us scenes of daily life in this alternate reality, individuals moving with a fluidity and a confidence that, to our eyes, borders on the divine. Nudity, for example, isn't an issue. There's no sexual or vulnerable connotation, because the gaze that judges, that objectifies, that separates the body from its function and essence, doesn't exist. The body is simply a vehicle for experience, a tool perfectly adapted to its environment, and not a source of embarrassment or pride. The art they produce, according to the simulation, is purely expressive, not confessional. There are no poems about the anguish of loneliness or paintings that scream the pain of isolation, because those concepts are alien. Creativity flows not as an escape from inner suffering, but as a celebration of shared existence. The very notion of privacy as we know it, the act of hiding to protect a fragile self, loses its meaning. But make no mistake, this doesn't create a utopia of empty smiles or a robotic humanity devoid of passion. The absence of original sin doesn't eliminate pain, loss, or conflict. The fundamental difference lies in how these experiences are processed. The AI shows us an event where a community loses an ancestral tree to a lightning strike. The sadness is deep, real, but it's not internalized as a personal failure or divine punishment. It's an ecological grief, felt collectively, that immediately transforms into constructive action. Planting new trees, reconfiguring the space, honoring the memory of the one that is gone. Anger, in turn, isn't the poison of a wounded ego, but a clear signal that something is out of balance in the system. It's a corrective force, not a destructive one. In this alternate timeline, the driving force of action isn't anxiety or the search for validation, but an intrinsic, pure desire to participate in creation, to understand the universe, and to deepen the connection with the whole. The self doesn't need to be proven or defended because it has never felt separate from the we or the environment around it. So what our simulation reveals is a humanity whose fundamental identity resides not in the individualistic self, but in a network consciousness, an expansive we. They live in a state of near-perfect harmony where individual will and collective will, or even divine will, are not opposing forces, but facets of the same reality. It's an existence without the anguish of moral choice as we know it, as the right action is felt intuitively, like breathing. But this harmony, this absence of inner conflict, raises a fundamental and somewhat unsettling question, a paradox that the simulation itself struggles to resolve. If their will is so perfectly aligned with the Creator's, if disobedience is a concept so alien it doesn't even register, are they truly free? Or are they living in a kind of perfect, gilded cage? This is where our exploration leads us to one of the Greya, freedom without the fall. The divine paradox is precisely the point where our AI simulation starts to generate results that challenge our Western logic, forged in the concept of free will as the ability to say no. For us, freedom is defined by the possibility of rebellion, by the choice to take a different path, even if it's the wrong one. It's the freedom of Adam and Eve in our world, the freedom to disobey. But in this alternate timeline, where disobedience is an alien concept, what does it mean to be free? The simulation confronts us with an answer that is at once simple and profoundly complex. Their freedom isn't the freedom to choose between good and evil, but the freedom to explore the infinite spectrum of good. It's a fundamental paradigm shift. Think with me. Is a fish free in the ocean? It can't choose to fly. It can't choose to live on land. Its freedom exists within the parameters of its nature and its environment. It's free to explore the depths, to hunt, to reproduce, to navigate currents we can't even comprehend. Its prison, the water, is actually the very condition for its existence and its ultimate expression of freedom. Our AI simulation applies this same logic to the humanity of a continuous Eden. Their nature, uncorrupted by the fall, is perfectly attuned to the will of the Creator, which, in this interpretation, is not a will to control, but a will for flourishing and creation. Therefore, their freedom isn't the freedom to challenge the system, but to innovate infinitely within it. The AI shows us this in a practical way. When faced with a problem, like a river threatening to change its course, the community doesn't debate whether or not to intervene. Intervention is a given. Freedom lies in the how. One proposes a canal, another suggests a system of terraces to take advantage of the new floodwaters. A third imagines a new form of floating habitation. Freedom is the explosion of creativity, the multiplicity of harmonious solutions, and not the option to let the catastrophe happen. This is where it gets fascinating, because it redefines the very nature of the relationship between the creator and the created. In our timeline, this relationship is often seen as that of a lawmaker and a citizen, a king and his subject. There are laws, and freedom lies in obeying or breaking those laws and facing the consequences. In this simulation, the relationship is more like that of a composer and their orchestra. The composer sets the key, the main theme, the structure of the symphony. But each musician is free to improvise, to add their own color, their own texture, their own passion, as long as it serves the beauty of the music as a whole. Freedom isn't playing a dissonant note just to prove you can, but finding the most beautiful, unexpected note that still belongs to that harmony. They are co-creators of the universe, not mere tenants afraid of eviction. Their will is not subjugated by the divine will. It is a tributary that flows naturally into the same great river. This freedom, therefore, is not the absence of choice, but freedom from specific type of choice, the choice to self-destruct. It's the freedom from having to deal with the impulse to sabotage one's own happiness or that of others. And a humanity that never learned to hate itself, that never felt the crushing weight of guilt. How would it begin to build its world? What kind of civilization, what kind of history emerges when the first page isn't about a fall, but about a continuous ascent? It's the beginning of a new era, and its cascading consequences will redraw everything we understand about progress. Guiltless humanity. The dawn of a new era begins not with a bang, but with a silence that is, to us, deep and unsettling. It's the silence of a conscience that never had to hide, that never heard the echo of accusation in its own mind. Spared the fall, humanity in this alternate timeline isn't simply good. It operates on a fundamentally different psychological system, guilt, that invisible engine behind so much of our art, our religion, and our justice systems, simply doesn't exist as a concept. Our AI simulation shows us that in its place, something far more proactive and less paralyzing flourishes, an innate sense of harmonic responsibility. It's the difference between feeling bad for breaking a vase and feeling an irresistible urge to gather the shards and create an even more beautiful mosaic from them. The former is about the past and transgression, the latter about the future and restoration. Imagine what that does to daily interactions. The simulation presents us with a scene that, to us, is trivial, but here, it's revealing. Two people are building a bridge over a stream. A calculation is off, and a section of the structure gives way. In our timeline, the immediate reaction would be a dance of accusations and apologies. I told you so. It was your fault. No, it was yours. an ego-driven game to deflect the weight of the mistake. Not here. The AI visualizes their faces, and there's no anger or shame. There's an expression of dissonance, like a musician hearing an off-key note in a symphony. The reaction isn't to blame one another, but a shared urgency to reharmonize the situation. They look at each other, and the communication is almost telepathic, focused entirely on the problem. The mistake isn't a moral failing, but a puzzle that has presented itself to be solved. This absence of guilt removes the friction of ego from almost all human interactions, enabling a collaboration and efficiency that sound like superpowers. This new mental software triggers cascading consequences that redraw the very notion of civilization. Without the need for atonement, there are no sacrifices on altars. Without the concept of original sin, religion doesn't become an institution of control and absolution, but a philosophical and celebratory exploration of the universe. Our simulation shows us centers of learning that look more like observatories and biological labs than cathedrals. Technological progress, in turn, follows a completely different trajectory. In our history, much of innovation was driven by war, fear, and competition for scarce resources. Here, the engine is curiosity, aesthetics, and the desire to create more efficient and beautiful systems that integrate with the natural world. The AI generates images of cities that seem to have grown organically from the landscape, with buildings made of self-repairing materials and energy generated by processes that mimic photosynthesis. The nature versus man dichotomy that defines our industrial age doesn't exist. Man is the planet's conscious gardener, and his technology is his most sophisticated gardening tool. Even the idea of justice is unrecognizable. Without crime born of envy, greed, or resentment, what's left? The simulation shows us that behavioral deviations are treated not as crimes but as illnesses or imbalances. A person who acts disharmoniously isn't imprisoned but taken through a process of realignment. This sentence might be spending time working in a damaged ecosystem to understand the practical impact of disharmony, or collaborating with artists to learn how to create beauty from chaos. Justice isn't punitive, it's therapeutic. Its goal isn't to make the individual pay for a mistake, but to ensure they can once again be a functional and harmonious member of the collective symphony. It's a society that doesn't waste energy containing its worst impulses, because those impulses were never sown. All that energy is channeled into creation, exploration, and understanding. This is the foundation of this new era, a civilization that advances in unison, driven by a fearless curiosity and a boundless creativity. They aren't running from a past of sin. They're actively building a future of infinite potential. But if their starting point is a continuous ascent, a trajectory never broken or diverted by the trauma of the fall, where exactly are they headed? What shape does a future take when it has never been thrown off its original course? That is what unbroken destiny. The future that remained intact reveals itself in our AI simulation not as a static utopia, but as a trajectory of infinite potential finally realized. While our history is a series of painful resets, of empires rising and falling, of knowledge lost and rediscovered, this humanity's timeline is an unbroken ascending line. The cascading consequences of the absence of the fall created a civilization that, millennia ago, reached a point we can't even imagine as our distant future. Energy is limitless, cleanly drawn from the stars themselves or from the quantum vacuum. Diseases have been eradicated, understood not as invaders but as systemic imbalances that can be corrected at a genetic level. Here, AI isn't an external tool but a symbiosis, an extension of the collective consciousness that manages complex planetary logistics, freeing every human for their true calling, exploration and creation. The simulation transports us to what would be their present. We don't see skyscrapers but engineered ecosystems. Entire cities that breathe, with structures that grow, heal, and adapt to the climate like colossal trees. We see an individual in what looks like the Atacama Desert, but instead of aridity, they're standing amidst a field of solar panels that look like giant flower petals. following the sun and collecting not just light but moisture from the air, transforming the landscape into a productive oasis. The person isn't working in our sense of the word, they're composing. Their interface, projected directly into their field of vision, shows data streams that look more like a musical score. They're adjusting the field's harmonic resonance to optimize photosynthesis, while simultaneously creating a subtle melody that can be heard by the entire local biosphere. Work has become art. Engineering has become music. Survival has given way to expression on a planetary scale. Daily life isn't a struggle, but an active, conscious participation in the great work of uplifting and beautifying the world. Humanity's focus has fundamentally shifted. Having mastered their own planet in a way that nourishes rather than depletes it, their gaze has turned outward, but not with the spirit of conquest that marked our space age. They aren't building ships to forcibly colonize planets. The AI simulation shows us projects of a magnitude that defies our comprehension. We see interstellar seeders, asteroid-sized probes designed to travel for millennia to promising star systems. They don't carry colonists, but the genetic code of terrestrial life, adapted to flourish in new worlds. Their goal isn't to replicate themselves, but to spread the very principle of life throughout the cosmos. It is the ultimate act of the gardener, not just to tend one's own garden, but to give seeds to the cosmic wind so that new gardens might be born elsewhere. Their science has become so advanced, it borders on metaphysics. They aren't just studying the laws of physics, they're trying to understand the grammar behind them. The driving question is no longer how does the universe work, but why is the universe beautiful? This search for beauty and inherent purpose in the cosmos has led them to the threshold of the final question. They have traced the history of the universe back to the Big Bang, decoded the DNA of life, and harmonized their own planet. Now they find themselves before the original design, the underlying architecture of all existence. They don't seek a heavenly father to ask for forgiveness or a judge to fear. They seek an architect to admire the blueprint, a composer to understand the symphony. This proximity, this absence of primal fear, raises the deepest question of all. If humanity never felt separate from its creator, what is that relationship like today, after millennia of uninterrupted evolution? And what if we had never hidden from God? What if we had never hidden from God? That's the question hanging over this alternate timeline, the ultimate consequence of that single point of divergence in the Garden of Eden. For us, our relationship with the divine is a matter of faith, of sacred texts, of rituals, and often of a daunting silence. It's a search for something we feel we've lost. For this humanity, however, there was never any loss. The conversation was never interrupted. The AI simulation shows us that the concept of religion, as we know it, simply doesn't exist. There are no dogmas, no clergy, no temples built to appease a distant God. Because God was never distant. Their search for the Creator isn't a spiritual journey of redemption, but the final, natural frontier of scientific inquiry and artistic expression. It's the direct continuation of physics, biology, and cosmology. Our simulation takes us to an observatory that defies imagination. It's not a telescope pointed at the sky, it's a pulsating sphere of energy, floating at the Lagrange point between a planet and its moon. Inside, we see human beings in a state of deep, connective meditation. They aren't looking at the universe, they're immersed in it. The interface they use doesn't display data on screens, but translates the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, the cosmic microwave background, the gravitational dance of galaxies, into a symphony of patterns, colors, and sounds. They are, in effect, listening to the signature of the Big Bang, not as a dead echo, but as the first note of a composition that's still being played. The divine for them is not a personal entity with desires and commandments, but the very logic, beauty, and intentionality inherent in the fabric of reality. God is the elegant equation, the perfect symmetry, the emergent complexity. The act of worship is the act of understanding. Prayer is the formulation of a new hypothesis to test the limits of the cosmos. This absence of fundamental separation has completely redefined the purpose of existence. While our history is marked by a deep existential anxiety, the search for meaning in a universe that often seems indifferent, theirs is a journey of conscious participation. They see themselves not as accidental tenants of the universe, but as its gardeners and artists, junior partners in the great work of creation. The cascading consequences of this are stunning. There's no fear of death, only an understanding of the transition of matter and energy. There's no guilt, only the responsibility to maintain harmony. AI, its symbiotic partner, isn't feared as a potential usurper, but seen as a tool that allows them to perceive and interact with the Creator's complexity on a scale the biological mind alone could not. They don't seek paradise, they expand it. Their cosmic mission to seed life on other worlds isn't an act of arrogance, but the fulfillment of what they understand as the universe's most fundamental impulse. Life itself propagating and becoming aware of its own beauty. The simulation ends, and the image of that humanity in communion with the cosmos dissolves, returning us to our own reality, with its cathedrals, its laboratories, its conflicts, and its imperfect beauty. That single moment, the refusal of a fruit, the failure of a serpent, didn't just change human destiny, it rewrote the very nature of our relationship with the universe and its creator. Perhaps our entire history, with its pain, its art, its science, and its relentless search for answers, is just the long, winding path back to a garden we should never have left, the attempt to listen to a conversation we ourselves interrupted. The power of that one divergence point is immense, showing that our reality, with all its scars, is just one of infinite possibilities on the tree of history. What detail or consequence of this alternate history did you find most impactful? Technology as art, science as worship, or the total absence of guilt? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you, like us, believe that history is a laboratory of infinite possibilities, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Together, we'll continue to use the power of artificial intelligence to challenge the present by exploring the pasts that never were.